On today's episode of Whiplash with Maxwell Kuzma, before Pope Francis, being queer and Catholic meant silence or worse. Then came a pope who spoke of mercy.
He broke bread with us and backed documents that erased us. So what's his legacy?
This week on Whiplash, we break down the legacy Pope Francis leaves behind and what it means for queer Catholics now. Welcome to Whiplash with Maxwell Kuzma,
the show where two queer Catholics, Max and Emma, dive into the dark and twisty Catholic faith we were handed.
And the beautiful mess we're building in its place.
It's a journey of exploration, excavation, and deconstruction.
As we challenge the limited view of God we were taught,
and embrace a fully affirming, expansive Catholic faith.
No topic is off limits, and no question is too big or too small.
We're in this together, figuring out how to reconcile our queerness with our Catholicism, and maybe, just maybe, even reimagine them both.
So buckle up, folks. You might experience a little whiplash, but we're here for the ride.
Let's go! Welcome back to Whiplash, where we take sharp turns through Catholic culture, faith, and the mess in between. I'm Emma Cieslik.
And I'm Max Kuzma. Today, we're tackling the papacy of Pope Francis. What changed, what didn't, and why it matters now that he's gone.
Before Francis, we had decades of papal teaching that defined queerness as disordered and evil. We had radical traditionalist Catholics pushing a version of faith rooted in fear and control. Francis disrupted that. Sort of.
Yeah, he was a pope of contradictions, washing the feet of Muslims, migrants, and prisoners in Rome, while also calling gender a threat to humanity. Opening doors for conversation, eating pasta with trans women, then slamming them shut with Vatican documents like Dignitas Infinita. So today we're asking, what will his legacy be? And for queer Catholics especially, what does it mean to grieve a pope who offered both comfort and harm?
With that in mind, very much this episode came out of Max and I responding to current events. We originally had planned to explore, as we shared in the Substack post, reflecting on Pope Francis's legacy as well as far-right reaction to his death, about queer Catholic joy, especially in the moments after Easter and what the resurrection means for queer and trans Catholics. But with Pope Francis's death this past Monday, Easter Monday morning, at the age of 88, it was all about reconciling what it meant to lose both a pioneer for LGBTQ plus Catholics and many other marginalized communities, but at the same time understanding the limitations of what he did within a church that does not change quickly. With that being said, in this episode, we're going to talk a little bit more through the time before his papacy, what he was facing before he was elected into office, as well as his impact during his papacy, and what it means to move beyond and remember Pope Francis for what he has done and what he has left behind. I think it's really important to talk about what the church looked like before Pope Francis was elected. So before Pope Francis, as we've mentioned before on this podcast, radical traditionalists, also called rad trads, were a group within the Catholic Church who held particularly strong views on pre-Vatican II traditions. Mainly rad trads and sedevacantist, which is a subset that believes that Pope Francis was not a legitimate leader of the Catholic Church, argued that pre-Vatican II traditions were the only authentic version of Catholicism to practice. Often among American Catholics and Catholic nationalists around the world, the implications were that reverting to a pre-Vatican II tradition and liturgy of the Church also meant a return to pre-Vatican II worldviews, including gender roles, expectations, as well as social purviews of the time. Many people today are comparing discussions about pronatalism among J.D. Vance, who visited the Pope mere hours before he passed away, to pre-Vatican II traditions of the 1950s and 1960s. And I present that with a caveat to say that just like many conservatives and far-right Americans and nationalists around the world, the idealization of a mid to late 20th century world where white cis men remained in power, but also that women, queer people and others existed or were visible is false, cannot exist. There was never a time when things were great, as we have learned. Well, with that in mind, we're just phrasing that before Pope Francis came into office, there was this big push for radical traditionalist Catholicism that viewed the popes that predated him, including John Paul II, as invalid because they were they were seeing over and guiding a church that was pushing and reinforcing Vatican II. To be honest, Pope Francis, when he came in, was very determined about reinforcing that they were going to, as a church, follow post-Vatican II traditions. Now, some earlier predecessors right before him gave some leniency to specific communities, especially SSPX and FSPX communities. But with that in mind, it was this building of tension of far-right forces as well as more liberal forces, just as Vatican II responded to, in an increasingly modernized world, what role the church was going to have.
Yeah, and it's very interesting too about the situation, because I know Pope Benedict was really loved by the traditionalists, probably for a lot of reasons. Like, much has been said about the contrast between Pope Francis, who embraced the very simple attire, just the plain white, versus like you see pictures of Pope Benedict and he's like blinged out, kind of like somebody who I guess would be maybe a contemporary in terms of thought of Cardinal Burke, right? Like, he is also known for the blinged out pictures with the big red hat and like the huge lace train, I think it is. And there's always some tongue in cheek stuff in the trans community. Like, so the dudes that are wearing all these like long flowing dresses and stuff, they're the ones who are like sassing us about being, expressive of gender or whatever. But yeah, I know. So Benedict was very loved, especially because he was like the quintessential, almost like the fedora hat theologian of Catholicism, with the cigars. Like, I don't know. I went to Franciscan University of Steubenville back in my conservative days, and that was like a cliche that we saw around campus. That guy that was like with the fedora, definitely with a beard. And J.D. Vance, in his conversion, he definitely grew the Catholic beard. And then we've talked about that too with like the certain defectors, like Strickland, Joseph Strickland, who was Bishop of Texas, who just was like, yeah, I don't think the Pope is actually the Pope. And so then the Pope was like, bet you're not, if you're not going to act Catholic, then you don't get to be Catholic. Like, respecting the Pope is kind of the whole bit. But anyway, I remember being, and I've talked about this before on here, being very aligned with that idea of you were not made for comfort, you were made for greatness, which takes on so many layers when you have a queer identity that you're sort of being asked to, or it feels like you're being pressured to or forced. That's a different type of sacrifice than what cishet people would necessarily be required or asked to do. I also just wanted to make a note about the idealization. To me, the idealization of the 1950s is fascinating for so many reasons, but like, really, I feel like it's the Scooby-Doo meme where you pull back the mask and you're like, oh yeah, it's just like white supremacy all along, because like, yeah, there was an idealized world, but it was for white, straight, default people who fit into this system, and the story that was sold was about those people who were not in that description did not have a great time in the 1950s. So it's not really aspirational unless you maybe have some more sinister feelings going on.
No, and I think it's so important because I also want to build into here is that the 1950s, historically, as we know, in the 1950s and 1960s, we were getting into the Cold War era. So the idea of McCarthyism in the United States and the government and social organizations predatorily going after queer people, trying to single them out and seeing them as vulnerable in federal service. Just this past week, the Rainbow History Project here in DC recognized the 60th anniversary of the 1965 picket out in front of the White House, which was a picket by queer federal workers about their rights and their right to employment, and thinking about how that applies today in predatory whistleblowing systems about reporting people in DEI programs. But I could go on and on about the history. You know I could, Max.
I absolutely love the history tangents and the passion. This episode already is off to a great start, and I'm living.
Well, and I think what you talk about is so incredibly important because as we're talking about radical traditionalists, as we're talking about Benedict, John Paul II, we also have to think about theology of the body. Because as people, as queer Catholics that are thinking critically about Pope Francis's legacy, lots of our work is going to be framed by discussions of gender and sexuality.
Yeah.
So we've mentioned it before on the podcast, but if you're not familiar, Theology of the Body was the topic of a series of 129 lectures given by Pope John Paul II during audiences at St. Peter's Square and Paul VI Audience Hall between 1979 and 1984. So again, an increasingly conservative time right as we see the start of the HIV and AIDS pandemic in the United States and abroad. So what it was, in his words, an analysis on human sexuality. So while it didn't directly address LGBTQ plus issues, it has been interpreted by many, including LGBTQ plus affirming scholars and not, as negative in the same-sex attraction, gender identity, and LGBTQ plus affirmation. Its view is very limiting, not only, as we've discussed, in gender essentialism, in the roles of men and women and their prescribed biological determinism and how they're supposed to present and act, but also what roles they're supposed to play. And so through that, they necessitate kind of this essentialized idea of marriage, of male and female identity, but also in kind of combating same-sex relationships. A lot of that philosophy around theology of the body also reinforces purity culture, which we've discussed as well. This idea that chastity is a virtue that enables individuals to live out their sexuality in a way that's faithful to God's plan and reinforces love and marriage through the concept of waiting. It's both of these ideas very much fed into the 1980s with conservatism rising in the United States as well as Reaganomics, but also to purity culture in the 1990s and early 2000s. So just as we're going to talk about in this episode, even though this is about a leader of a worldwide religious organization, these leaders are intimately affecting the politics and social norms of the United States today. So even sometimes because we are under the impression that maybe Catholicism or the Vatican leaders act in a vacuum, or they're only impacting the estates or the events of the Catholic Church as a whole, not politics. Benedict and Pope John Paul II were intimately involved in the politics of the United States. And even as we think about Pope Francis's death, one of the big takeaways was that Conclave, which was a film that came out this past year, viewership has risen according about 283%, according to Illuminate, because people are engaging with and curious about this incredibly secretive process that's now about
Since
to
his
take
passing.
place. Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. The point about the intimate connection to events happening in American politics, but also position of Pope is not, completely isolated. It's connected to all these other things that are going on. And as it regards America, with theology of the body, for me, it's impossible to ignore the connection to the evangelical world. We always talk about the way that the rad trads and certain Catholic movements, like contemporary of now, have been playing from the evangelical playbook, the Unholy Alliance. You can see that with this topic as well, because you said the dates for the series of talks, 1979 to 1894. Well, the term complementarianism, which kind of speaks to the same type of rhetoric and ideas that were developed in theology of the body, that term emerged in the evangelical world in the 1980s, which is essentially the same time. And to the point too, I've never really considered, I've always considered theology of the body from my perspective as a transgender man. So I've always seen it. I remember reading it intensely in high school when I was going in my deep Google years, where I was like, I will deeply Google all these things to find every conceivable nuance as it relates to gender and LGBTQ identity, even though I didn't know those words, or even though I wasn't doing it from that perspective. That's what I was looking for. And I remember when I read it, I was really trying to figure out like how I could make it work, because I was like, well, this is really beautifully written. But like, it so doesn't resonate with me. It's said so authoritatively, as if this is something that would be self-evident, like almost like a common sense type of argument, like, which is what a lot of people return to with trans issues. Where like, oh, it's just common sense that there's only men and women and that's it. And I'm like, okay, well, common sense kind of erases the fact that we have people who are experts, that we have people who are able to explore and understand things in greater depth than a common person would be able to do. Like, the truth is that we need people who understand things deeply to translate and explain things to us. And we need the people who are having the lived experience of something to be important members of that conversation too.
I think it's especially harmful because it's the idea that just by virtue of what or how your body presents, or what it is, the ways in which that you were created, that is therefore going to determine the life that you lead and how you identify, which I think is really toxic. And it plays into the idea of pronatalism right now with focusing. There was just a New York Times article this week about how Trump wants more women to have more children. And so thinking critically about that idea of how it's exclusionary of trans men that can also be pregnant, but also how it's really harmful to single and childless women, and how it's placing both a burden, but like a social barrier on them moving forward. So it's affecting every strata of people in this community.
Yes, that biological determinism was what rubbed me the wrong way. And I didn't know why at the time. I was like, man, he really seems to think that your identity flows from who you are in this very embodied way. Like, I agreed with this idea that you can embody your identity, like from a zoomed out perspective, but this idea that it's so narrow that women are, by virtue of being women, they are nurturing. Men, by virtue of being men, they are the protectors or whatever. Like, and we know, and we've talked about how fundamentalist systems want people to play these very specific roles because it's easier if people are behaving in uniform ways. It's easier to handle and control and things like that. But I just knew that was not the reality for me. But so locating it in the time period and thinking about the connections to all the political landscape going on, knowing that this was at the time of AIDS, which was largely stigmatized clearly, but also largely ignored at the beginning because people were like, well, oh, it's just a gay disease. And then also to your point about having purity culture connections, like, I don't think I ever at the time really thought through that because I was so in my trans feels, but it's a very important point to show the interconnectedness of all these things, to show as well the cyclical nature of how the arguments flow into each other, because you just see kind of the same recycled arguments through different ways. Like the McCarthyism, just takes a different form. Like right now it's pretty much anybody who's brown.
100%. And just exactly going off what you said, very much during Benedict and John Paul II's tenure, it was very much queer people. So especially before Pope Francis's time, there have been a lot of publications in the last week after Francis's death reacting to his impact on LGBTQ plus people inside and outside of the church. And they are fair in acknowledging that there were limitations in his approach, which we'll delve into in a little bit. But it was entirely different from the approach of Benedict and John Paul II, which had described homosexuality as an intrinsic moral evil and an objective disorder. So they were very into promoting, including the idea of self-loathing, remaining in the closet, as well as the idea of self-harm. through these programs of conversion therapy, but also through systems of remaining closeted and internalizing homophobia that continued. Benedict was the author of the Vatican's current articulation of the Catholic Church's official teaching on homosexuality. So in 1986, he issued a letter as Cardinal Prefect from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith that's well known and highly contested. And the language drew on this idea of it being intrinsically disordered and a moral evil. Surrounding the idea of the inclination of the homosexual person and having a tendency towards evil. We say that this language is outdated, and Francis pushed against this idea, but it's still one that infiltrates many far-right circles. Especially with all that happened with John Paul II, there was great discussion of his rant against LGBTQ plus people in response to the Great Jubilee of 2000 and the Pride of that time. So in July of that year, Rome was set to host World Pride, which this year will be hosted in Washington, D.C. And it was an entire week of events, culminating with a huge parade throughout the city. And with 200,000 to 300,000 people joining the event, the Catholic hierarchy came under intense pressure, and how John Paul II reacted through elements of very violent queerphobia, both emotionally and spiritually, and how he reacted to visitors to his city and members of his own community were especially harmful. It's something that stayed with queer Catholics to the day as well. And it's something that Francis was very intentional about trying to shift away from, but also trying to navigate what it looked like to change those policies in a church that does not change fast.
It's obvious, I think, to everybody how problematic the intrinsically disordered language is. To call out a group of people in that way, a group of people who have existed historically, like, you know, we have always existed, the queer community. And so to try to put us into this using this dehumanizing language is so deeply problematic. I remember as well, again, in my Googling days in high school, when I bumped up against that phrase almost always immediately led to now I'm looking at materials that I now know are conversion therapy. Whenever I encountered that, it was like an immediately, now I'm looking at conversion therapy materials. And so you can just see how devaluing, dehumanizing leads to practices that are harmful to people.
100%. You're so right. And then, of course, on the scene, Pope Francis was tenured in that position for 12 years. Then on the scene, from this idea of queer people being intrinsically disordered, in July 2013, Pope Francis famously shares with reporters asking him about LGBTQ plus priests, quote, "If someone is gay who searches for the Lord and has goodwill, who am I to judge?" And I'm sure the words could be heard around the world of this idea that he was turning his mind and his focus back to the teachings of Jesus about loving a neighbor, regardless of who they are. And as we'll discuss, that extended to his interfaith activities that he did, his acknowledgement and open apologies for Christian and Catholic boarding schools in North America. Arguably, just as they said in response to those apologies, and the French leader did, that they weren't enough, but they were first steps. So by September 2015, during his visit to the United States, Pope Francis only really had one personal meeting, and that was with his former student who was gay and his partner. So it was really sending a message, one that would reverberate throughout his entire papacy in his interactions with President Trump and in his former term, but also in his conversation most recently with J.D. Vance, where he had his associate in charge basically speak with Vance before his private audience with Vance to basically clarify around this idea of odo amoris, or this righteous construction of loving. So it was really an interesting time. And we see this all happening at the same time that he calls to end unjust discrimination against LGBTQ plus people, at the same time that he's also opposing same-sex marriage. So I also want to open it up that there's a lot of nuance in this conversation, that just as he's opening up the possibility for trans people to serve as godparents, just as he's eating pasta with a trans woman in the Vatican City, we also see moments like Dignitas et Venita. We also see conversations where he's asserting once again that marriage is between a man and a woman.
Even the whole, we haven't even really touched on the election of Pope Francis happening while a pope was still alive, which I don't remember exactly how many times that's happened, and I'm sure you've got the numbers here somewhere in your notes, Emma. It's very, very, very rare, because the whole thing is you're the pope, and then if you die, then there's a new pope. But my point being that it's kind of a wild way to kick off that the former pope is still alive. And here's the other thing, which I had to look up these numbers just yesterday because I was curious. These dates, I should say. So Pope Francis was elected in 2013. Pope Benedict didn't die until 2022.
Mm-hmm. And Pope Benedict was let me pull it up, the first pope to resign in 600 years.
In 600 years. And so, but my point is that, like, he was doing these things like the "who am I to judge" thing, and people are like, well, it's not enough. Well, like, he's literally got like the original, the OG, the number one Theo bro, the Catholic Theo bro, like over his shoulder. Like, this Benedict's alive this whole time. Like he only had 3 years of his papacy without Benedict. That's crazy for all the other things that he did in that time. But yes, to your point as well, the kind of the back and forth, and I'm sure we can get into gender ideology in more depth, because that was the big bad, and such a contrast between how Francis actually treated transgender people, myself included, who met the Pope in October of 2024. But I don't want to skip ahead if you have other things, Emma.
No, you go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. So the gender ideology witch hunt, maybe. Again,
a Catholic version of gender McCarthyism.
Yeah, no, I was literally just thinking that. That's what I mean about, like, how sort of there's like progressive movements and reactionary movements, and it's like always like slightly different versions of the same issues. It's just like, oh, this new mainstream thing that's never existed before. No one was ever trans before this became a social contagion. Okay, people, like, let's crack a history book. Let's take a moment. Let's look at the cultures in which transgender people were, like, given roles. Let's look in the Bible, where there's plenty of people who don't fit neatly into. But anyway, gender ideology was, to me, in many ways, it's like a red herring. It's like creating a villain or a straw man. It's creating something that's not a thing. But I also do kind of get it that these super old men who are these super big bookish nerds are getting excited about these ideas, because, like, when you create this idea of a philosophical movement, it can be easy to panic and be like, oh my gosh, it's going to infiltrate and take over everything. But there's two problems. One, that's not actually what is or was happening. And two, when you talk about something that way, it becomes associated with a group of people, as it did with the trans community, it's so harmful, mainly because there is no, when you start your transition or you decide that you want to be trans, there's no, like, paperwork sent to you that's like, do you agree to all the tenets of gender ideology? Transgender people are people. Like, we have all types of different interests and hobbies and things that we care about. There are Catholic transgender people, there are Christian transgender, there's Muslim transgender people, there's transgender people of no faith. Like, there is not one unifying ideology, similar to, like, the gay agenda. And it's like, okay, everybody, the queer agenda really is to survive, to be happy, to have the opportunity to thrive, to love people that you love and have a life of love and happiness. So, the whole gender ideology thing, Pope Francis was really hard on it, very strict on it. And I think he also got it from sort of this random, dry, dusty tome that I think was written in maybe the 40s, that had just painted this, it was a fictional work that had painted this idea of gender ideology. And again, dry, dusty nerd who got too into his fan fiction about the idea that that's this threat that's coming and it's an ugly danger that's going to infect people. Yet at the same time, towards the end of his life, started to really spend more time with trans people and was changing his mind in many ways. I mean, he spent 90 minutes with New Ways Ministry, and they had a varied group that included trans men, trans women, and even a doctor who was like, yeah, so like being trans is a thing. Also, an intersex person, very importantly, because Dignitas Infinita expressed intersex identity in a deeply problematic way that sought to, I believe the language was along the lines of correcting your intersex identity, which is very problematic. And if you talk to intersex people, you will understand that's such an intrusion on that person's identity. Like, let's let intersex people speak and tell us what their experience is like. And so he had this meeting with New Ways, and from their description of it, he wanted the full time. They were like super conscious. When you meet the Pope, you're like, okay, I got to get my talking points. And they said that he was so warm. He was so attentive. I think he even extended a little bit, like he wanted to stay with them longer than he was scheduled. And I've said before, and I do think this is the case, that had he lived longer and had the opportunity to form a greater friendship with more transgender people, I think it would have helped him to understand more, similarly to how he formed a friendship with Juan Carlos Cruz, and that, who was a gay Catholic man, and that really did also transform his perspectives. I mean, we literally now have the blessings for same-sex couples. So a lot of different pieces there.
100%, 100%. And I think what you speak to is important, is that Francis, as we've talked about in the masculinity series and our discussion of American leaders, was a significant Catholic leader and was very important to many people because he was willing to change his mind on things, which is often seen as a sign of weakness or instability. But in June 2016, a year after gay marriage was legalized in the United States, he was already saying that LGBTQ plus individuals and other marginalized communities in the church deserve an apology. Very much in the same way that other causes that he had championed. In the spring of 2022, he had made apologies to Indigenous survivors of Catholic and Christian boarding schools on his visit to Canada. Even though the Canadian government made clear after his visit that his apology was not enough on behalf of church-run residential schools, it was a step in the right direction, and one that after his death, many Indigenous communities are revisiting, for it being the first of the church to recognize its problems and apologize. In the same way, in 2015, a year before he offered this pseudo apology, I say with love, to queer people, before the World Meeting of Popular Movements in Santa Cruz, Bolivia, Pope Francis had apologized for the grave sins committed by the church in service of colonialism. It's the same way as one of the most grievous errors in my mind, again, one of many, Francis was a human person, was his use of homophobic slurs during his tenure as Pope. And it was not just once, but it was twice. And him
the
coming
twice
forward.
part.
Yeah.
The twice part.
Yeah.
I saw a hilarious TikTok video, and it was this woman who was like impersonating an Italian PR person. He's done it again.
I've seen this. I think it was the whole thing of, and I think in many ways it was an incredibly painful moment for queer people, especially because it was a pope that had reached out in many ways to the community. So they saw it as an affront or a step back for someone that had taken time to get to know us. But at the same time, it was the first discussion that we had surrounding LGBTQ plus individuals in the priesthood, which has been discussed slightly by John Paul II and Benedict, but was really put on center stage through those two very unfortunate incidents. But I will say, for that same reason, that he's changed his mind and apologized in many different ways that I don't think, as people have clarified, is enough, but is tangible steps.
Yeah, absolutely. Like his complex legacy makes me think about how we are not in our world today, especially, but in general, we're not always very good at nuance. We're not always very good at somebody who isn't just fully one thing or the other. And yet at the same time, I really do think there's power in gray areas, like a lot of power and a lot of hope and a lot of positivity.
I want to also transition back to the way that I framed this in discussing his legacy and before his papacy was thinking critically about radical traditionalist Catholics who, again, prioritize these really strict heteronormative cisgender norms that are problematic. But Pope Francis was kind of butting heads with radical traditionalists his entire papacy. Benedict was very much a champion, and even John Paul II had provided some leniency to these communities. But Pope Francis very much put his shoe in the sand, and basically said, "This is as far as we're going." The Second Vatican,
his non-velvet shoe, his
non-velvet shoe. But very much for that reason, in that he was under the philosophy that Vatican II took place because the church was at a moment in the 1960s during the second wave feminist movement when people were trying to understand how they could even be Catholic in a radically changing world. Francis apologized because he had brought to Rome an Amazonian synod during his papacy, and he apologized because the Amazonian synod had brought with them Pachamama statues. So it was an important moment, but also one where, again, he spoke openly about the statue incident, clarified that it was not with idolatrous intentions, as many people were saying, well, how dare you bring this Amazonian figure, this idea of Pachamama, who is an idea of a divine mother figure, very much closely associated with the Virgin Mary, into these spaces. But it was, again, where he had pushed up against this idea of radical traditionalism that John Paul II and Benedict had kind of tried to thread their way throughout their papacy to not make many enemies. And it was a big reason why, when Pope Francis died on Monday, the reaction to his death was wild.
People are like taking a keen interest in who is going to be the next pope in a way that feels very political to me. Like it's like they're acting like it's a political news cycle. And I've seen people saying, as long as we don't have a pope who's woke, I want a non-woke pope. And it's like, okay, you've made your position pretty clear there. And we've also, of course, seen actual politicians like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who essentially said, like, evil has been defeated now that the Pope is, like, after the Pope passed. When you participate in or align yourself with movements that are essentially anti-progressive and you're not the perfect candidate, you're just allying yourself, eventually they are going to come for you. She literally just alienated. I'm sure there are plenty of MAGA Catholics who saw that message and were like, what gives? Like, it's the same concept of like when you have gay folks in the community who don't accept trans people, but like for political reasons, because it's like, okay, guys, like we're all in this marginalized community together. Like kicking some of us off the life raft isn't going to save you. But I also wanted to say, you touched on the synod. I think that is a huge part of his legacy. It definitely set the stage to challenge the idea that only the men in charge are the only ones with any say or any authority. I mean, it's not the same thing, again, with baby steps. It's not like now suddenly regular Catholics are like making doctrine. That's not what the synod is. But it is giving a voice to people, similar to how he wasn't afraid to be seen with the queer community. He also was passing the mic, giving the opportunity to lay people to contribute in a meaningful way.
Yeah, there was an an importance in him being comfortable, being visible, and being around us, in the same way that Francis did a lot of local ministry for trans sex workers in Rome, including queer and trans homeless people in Rome and in the United States when he visited. So it comes as a real shock then in 2024, the year before his death, then we see the release of Dignitas Infinita, a really disappointing document.
Legitimizing the idea that there's not medical consensus about trans identity, which is basically the whole Republican Party playbook. And when I read that in a Vatican document, I was like, wow, like, can somebody please just actually talk to actual scientists, talk to actual trans people? I really felt Dignitas Infinitas was embarrassing. It's just embarrassing for a document to come out in 2024 that just did not take trans people into account. Like, we have the ability, we have the access to information. We should be able to bring the people who are directly involved and impacted by this into the actual conversation.
100%. And I think it was also the idea that it was damaging because Pope Francis had met with people in the community, and had fostered these relationships and this eagerness to learn, but at the same time denied that we had an awareness or an understanding or a knowledge in our own bodies, our genders, and our sexualities. And that we, as people experiencing these things, are able to tell and speak truth to them being real.
Exactly. And I actually met the Pope after this document came out, which was a very interesting turn of events. Not like directly after, but I believe it came out in March of 2024. And my meeting with him happened in October. And so it was very interesting because, so how that all happened, how it all happened is that because I have been involved in outreach and attended conferences, spoken at the 2024 conference, actually, there is a priest, an Italian priest, who arranges meetings between trans people and the Pope, who was at outreach. And so I kind of got connected through the group to him, and that's how I received an invitation to go meet Pope Francis after a general audience. And so the process was that we all got tickets. They were yellow. I still have mine, and it's like so cool. And it allows you to pass beyond the normal crowd in St. Peter's Square and kind of go up into like the special section where the Pope then, after the general audience, walks through, or as the case was for us, he was in a wheelchair, so he was wheeled through, and it's just a bunch of people, a bunch of random people that all are in this special section to meet the Pope. There's also the people that the newlyweds, who they will come in their wedding attire to receive a papal blessing. It's really like to see the magnetism and the personality and the warmth of the Pope in that way. Also to like watch the Pope mobile going around, that was pretty fun too. But yeah, that experience was really powerful. Especially like I've talked a lot, I've written about what it was like, shaking his hand, telling him in Spanish, I'm a transgender man and a friend of Father James Martin, and the beautiful pastoral warmth in his face when he shook my hand and emoted in response to that. But it was also very powerful to be like sitting in a row with other trans people, like being one of the member of the a member of the transgender community, also having this experience, the specialness of, I'm just an ordinary person. I'm just an ordinary Catholic person who is being seen and recognized and loved by the Pope in this intimate way. It's just a really powerful thing to see that he would do that.
100%. It's so incredibly important. And I think that not only speaks to the importance of having that audience and the Pope creating that space and that dialogue for people to speak authentically about their own experience and speak to truth, that they know their own bodies and they know what they're living through. But also the idea that Pope Francis, along with you and the group that you traveled with, has been open and engaging with outreach and New Ways Ministries. One of my favorite and most impactful moments was Pope Francis actually writing to outreach, and like writing a handwritten letter that was
Yes.
printed in like the front page of the second annual
Yes.
outreach conference bulletin. And I think my relationship with the church is still really complicated. But it was a hand of reassurance on my shoulder as I was going in to do a panel and really like
Yeah.
reconnecting and
Hmm.
redefining what my relationship between my sexuality and Catholicism looked like, that I felt comfortable that the leader of the church was open and
Yeah.
excited for what this conference was going to speak to, which
Yeah.
makes moments like Dignitas Infinita even more confusing and damaging because
And
we don't
frustrating.
understand where it's coming from.
Exactly.
What's been really telling is that immediately after Pope Francis's death this past Monday, a lot of the news stories have discussed and contemplated his legacy surrounding immigrant rights, migrant rights, specifically him using the papal jet to move migrants to safety, to bring them into the space, sitting down with homeless communities in the United States during his own visit, engaging in interfaith conversations, and particularly in late June 2015, apologizing not only to church run boarding schools, but also the oldest evangelical church for the church's own persecution during the Middle Ages. So, specifically for the Waldensian Church. And the legacies of harm that the church has caused, and also visiting the Arabian Peninsula and Iraq and starting friendships with people in those communities. But I think that especially after his death, what was most significant, and I think likely because of our own perspectives and what we were drawn to, a lot of media coverage spoke about his engagement with LGBTQ plus individuals. So we spoke about in our post Adore Ajar, following Francis's death and reflecting on it, that Eric Sammons, the quote unquote like dad of Catholic Twitter, had posted Deo Gratias immediately, like hours after the Pope had died. Now, granted, later on, he went back and clarified that I posted this after my mom and my dad had died, but I don't think the internet was quite convinced this
Hmm.
time.
I know.
Um, in the same,
Especially when you're the self-described
yes,
dad of Catholic Twitter.
again, this idea of far right and radical traditionalist priests and lay leaders who were pushing back and celebrating the idea that with Pope Francis's death, there might be the possibility of like more of a conservatively lenient Pope taking his place. Father Gerald Murray, who's been a regular contributor on Fox News, even told the network after Francis's death on Monday that he was asking them, quote, do we want to continue with Pope Francis's basically leftward radical movement in the church, or do we want to return to Pope John Paul II and Benedict, which was to affirm doctrine in the face of critiques, answer modern questions, unquote. So it was this idea of very clearly focusing on what is the end goal and objective. And I think it was reinforcing what we've talked about, that even though this is the head of a religious organization, it's someone that's going to intimately impact politics around the world, especially in places like Poland and the United States, where we see Catholicism, just like we talked about on our Catholic nationalism episode, being conflated and used as justification for far-right forms of white supremacy and Christian nationalism. A lot of people think that this is only a discussion about queer and trans people being able to access gender affirming care. But what we're talking about more likely is also people of all classes having access to healthcare, reproductive care, and reproductive justice. Cis white women having access to contraception, as well as gynecological care in rural spaces where they may not have access to it. In the same way that we're also thinking critically about in the Catholic Church that, yes, we may only be talking about queer and trans rights when we're talking about Pope Francis's legacy, but his ways of deconstructing the theology of the body, of thinking and having intimate and authentic conversations with queer and trans people, is radically changing how the church and people in the church are treating LGBTQ plus people as a whole, how they're engaging with reproductive care and gender affirming care, but also how they're treating marginalized communities as a whole. These one things, it's not just about queer and trans communities, it's about every other community that's impacted by this community losing its rights or access to basic human things.
A truly universal church, and this is what Pope Francis did model, is one that understands that there are basic human rights that should apply to everybody. Like, we should have human rights. And Pope Francis, even on the topic of homosexuality, on record did say that homosexual people should not be ejected from families and they should have access to civil unions. I remember, again, when attending Franciscan University of Steubenville, a very conservative stronghold, I remember debates raging about that. And I remember thinking at the time, even in my conservative days, I was like, well, this makes logical sense to me. Like, gay people are people and should have should have legal rights. Like, just because the church doesn't want to offer a gay marriage doesn't mean that they should have no civil or legal rights.
Exactly. And Pope Francis was very clear as well that even though he was not about extending the sacrament of marriage to same-sex couples, which again, I oppose as someone who would love to get married in the church
Yeah.
and whose uncle has called dibs on that sacrament as a priest, that he was in favor of civil unions that would protect the rights of queer people being able to access their partners and their partners' information in hospital settings, being able to make medical decisions for someone that they know intimately. And I think it's the idea of like slippery slope of like, and I think it's difficult because this idea of like Pope Francis calling for civil unions for same-sex couples, this is an issue that his discussions of marriage are also having ramifications for people who are divorced, who historically in the church have been ostracized or unable to receive communion because, and for the reasons that they may have divorced their partner, for any reason that's valid, they're all valid. But there are people who experience sexual violence and abuse in marriages. So the idea that there's an unequivocal no in separation and seeking distance from a partner or ending a marriage if it's toxic or harmful, the idea that that would exclude you from receiving the Eucharist is really harmful and toxic. Being so stoic and rigid in the ways that we practice faith and the ways that we define human constructs, including gender binaries, is very much where the problem arises. The idea that traditionalism and rigidity of all roles, including spiritual ones, is a form of sacredness and a form of faithfulness. Disrupting that is important and has led to a lot of focus on Pope Francis.
So much of what we see when institutions are built up so much, we see a clear diversion from the way that a individual man like Jesus acted and behaved and reached out to people and was present to people. It's like this. It's just, the more something is built up into this big thing and this big system, the more potential harm there is to people who don't fit into that system for whatever reason. So I really think Pope Francis's life, his whole life, but also especially his time as Pope, is an example of what it would look like if somebody who is at the top of one of these institutions is actually acting more like that man on the street, more like Jesus, and what that means. And even though it doesn't change the harms that have happened, even though it doesn't magically fix everything, and even when that individual man messes up, which he did, it's still more like what the religion of Catholicism says that it's from, like to act actually like Jesus. But I want to ask you, Emma, so to turn it back around, what do you think happens next? What do you think is the likely outcome? And do you think a rightward shift in the Vatican is possible?
I think that's a great question. And I will say that I have hope that Francis has opened the door for people being engaged and having a vested interest in who fills that Pope position. Because I think it ties back to the idea of why people are watching Conclave, because they have a vested interest. Pope Francis was valuable and affected, both for good and for bad, the lives of many millions and billions of people, including those who are not Catholic.
Yeah.
So I see it as something where, especially coming from a time of increased radical traditionalism before his papacy to pushing back and creating so much friction with these communities, which he had to do by virtue of trying to counter some of these. I just see it as necessity that there is a little bit of swing right of the pendulum or a little bit of right backlash. And I think part of that is what we're seeing after Pope Francis's death, of priests and far-right leaders alike basically voicing their, in many ways, they're thank gods that like Pope Francis has finally gone, and that they now have an option, have a moment, have a space to basically step into that void. I know there have been far right Catholic leaders now that are calling on donations to get people in positions of leadership, to get their victor like elected to the papacy, even though there's no way that you and I can be part of that decision. So I think it's one thing where it inevitably will shift to the right, whether that's slightly or to a greater extent, I don't know. But I do know that Pope Francis has made tangible changes in starting conversations. I think in many ways he's made a lot of mistakes. And in the beginning, especially, and even towards the end, sometimes he was reinforcing systems of power that were especially harmful that the church had succeeded and built power on, through the land that they possess, through the money that they have, through the artifacts that they still need to give back to communities and repatriate from their Vatican museum. Yes. That's my museum worker hat talking.
Yes.
But I think he's opened the door. I think there will be a right-wing reaction. And I think part of these comments following his death is that reaction. But I think that people now have a vested interest. If they see the possibility, or at least the inklings of a possibility, of what an affirming or a more inclusive pope can look like and the impact that he will have, the awkwardness that he creates in like an audience with Trump, like just him providing friction, stopping some people in their paths and prompting people, if not to change direction, to pause, I think is especially important, and something that I think people are now interested in knowing who can do that and if it'll happen again.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think that's a really great take on it, because like all the people that are like so wrapped up in who it's going to be, it's like, well, we don't really have that much control. And the whole thing about the conclave is that they don't hear any of what we're saying because they're going to be sequestered. So it's kind of like whatever they figure out, however it shakes out within their discussions, which makes sense why that movie has popped up again, because people are like, well, what exactly is going on in there? Like, what are they doing?
But I also love how much that Conclave really got a following among LGBTQ plus audiences. Totally. I especially loved that, not only about the memes of, and for however cruel they were, of JD Vance killing the Pope, but also like the memes when Conclave came out, of like Conclave and the Vatican at like being like an example of like religious drag race.
Yeah.
And just like you said, very much in the same things of these inner dialogues, these internal church politics of people being held accountable for their actions. And we won't spoil it for you, but an ending twist that makes you think about intersex identity in the church. Like all of these things. It's a really interesting take on people being interested and feeling like they could have a voice in understanding what this process looks like. And I think, if anything, that is the product of the Synod of Synodiality, when we think that we have a voice, even if that may not be true, but we feel we have a vested interest and can make change in a church that for so long has felt inaccessible.
Francis's papacy gave us moments of hope, of visibility, of being heard. But it also reminded us that the church changes slowly, if at all.
We're left with a legacy that's complicated, contradictory, and still unfolding. The backlash has already begun, and a shift to the right seems not just possible, but likely.
So we'll keep showing up. As queer Catholics, we'll keep remembering, resisting, and reimagining. Thanks for being with us in that work.
If this episode moved you, challenged you, or just made you yell at your phone or computer, we want to hear from you. Drop a comment, share the episode, or join the conversation on social media.
We'll see you next time on Whiplash.
Goodbye!